Angel Island looms large in my family's history. My name is Connie Young Yu. My mother, Mary Lee Young, saved documents, letters, and photos. The paper trail, which tells the story of Mrs. Lee Yoke Suey, my grandmother. She was detained on Angel Island for 15.5 months. Our story begins with a young bride of 18, Jeong Hing Tong. She married my grandfather, Lee Yoke Suey, in China, and he brought her home to San Francisco in 1904. Here they are together on their wedding day. On the day of the Great Quake, April 18, 1906, they were in Chinatown with their month-old baby daughter. My grandfather was a U.S. citizen by birth. This is the certificate he risked his life to save in the aftermath of the 1906 quake. He ran to the ruins of his store and retrieved his birth certificate and important business papers. A soldier thought he was a looter and bayoneted him. Luckily, he was wearing a padded coat and his wound wasn't deep. San Francisco recovers from the great disaster and rebuilds. My grandparents and their little children returned to Chinatown. Chinese merchants were a major part of the city's commerce. The Lee's store was Guangsangwo, and they had a successful importing and exporting business. Here's a 1909 portrait of my grandfather and his brothers and their families. That's my grandmother holding my mother, her third daughter, on her lap. Lee Yoke Suey became an agent for Levi Strauss and also the Haas brothers. They exported American goods to China. He became a friend of Walter and Charles Haas. Grandpa was highly regarded by the company, judging by this picture of a banquet they gave in his honor in 1919, before he departed for China. And this is a group portrait of him with the Haas brothers. They also lived in Shanghai, where the children went to a Cantonese school. Lee Yoke Suey was a director of the Oriental Trade Company. This is a photograph taken in Shanghai. Even a person of Lee's merchant status was often questioned and detained while traveling on business. This was the exclusion era, when Chinese were regarded with suspicion by authorities. These are the papers documenting how he was detained while traveling and needed the help of the Haas brothers to facilitate his passage. He also requested help from Walter Haas on behalf of his brother, who was detained on Angel Island. On a trip back to China in September of 1922, Lee Yoke Suey succumbed to liver cancer and died on board ship. My grandmother decided to return with her children to America. San Francisco was their real home. Their ship arrived on January 15, 1924. This was the year the harshest exclusion law was enforced, prohibiting aliens ineligible for citizenship from entering. My grandmother had a re-entry permit stating she was a wife of a citizen and a merchant, but the inspector said she was a widow and declared she had lost her status upon her husband's death. Her children, American citizens by birth, were allowed to land. My grandmother, Wang Shi in her documents, was taken in a tugboat to Angel Island for investigation. There, upon examination, the medical officer, Inspector Hickey, declared she had chlornochiasis, common liver fluke, easily cured, but she was ordered to be deported immediately. My mother and her older sister asked for help from Walter Haas, who had his legal counsel, Charles Fickard, stop the deportation. Telegrams were sent to Washington. Meanwhile, my grandmother waited in the detention barracks. She was known as Wang Shi in her identity papers, and in a later hearing, she was referred to simply as the Detained. The first appeal was denied. Another would take months. Haas brothers sent letters in defense of Mrs. Lee and gave encouragement to the daughters. His lawyer, Charles Fickard, brought forth vigorous arguments. He declared it was unjust, unconstitutional, and inhumane to hold Mrs. Lee. He garnered public sympathy for her case. Meanwhile, my grandmother was becoming discouraged. The appeals process was very long and complicated. There were missionaries of various denominations on Angel Island, spreading the gospel and comforting the detainees. My grandmother was given catechism lessons by Father Bradley. My mother visited her 3 times a week in the administration building, and during those 15-minute visits, there was always a guard watching them. My mother was able to bring in special foods such as steamed pork and salted fish and rice. The case went to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. Fickard brought in medical experts who could prove that liver fluke condition was non-contagious. Mrs. Yoke Suey was treated successfully and given a medical clearance. She was released from Angel Island to join her children in San Francisco. The date ever in my mother's memory was April 29, 1925, end of detention. Her mother had been held 15.5 months in the barracks on Angel Island. Here my mother is showing Walter and Elsie Haas the old photos of Yoke Suey with the Haas brothers. In 1974, my mother went to Angel Island with filmmaker Frida Lee Mock to see the barracks where her mother was imprisoned, and actually look out the window where years ago she had seen her mother waving to her. She could read the poems on the walls of other detainees. Here's the scene from Zhongsai, Chinese Americans, the film by Frida Lee Mock, showing my mother's return to Angel Island.
It has been 50 years since my mother set foot on Angel Island, where her mother and most Chinese entering the United States were detained, sometimes for a few days, sometimes months, and like my grandmother, for years.
My building, there it is. That's the one? Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
So you get off and walk on the road?
Walk up there. So Bobo waved me. I saw her.
Did she have any belongings with her?
佢有好啲行李，佢唔想得佢拎咗啲大件嘅就拎翻屋企，佢啲箧袋啊拎嚟啲事。
Did you feel it would be so long?
Well, in those days, we feel ages. 一個月頭覺得好長好長，一年就更加長，好似10年咁長。
And you could recognize her. She said
佢有 small hand 就時話入我 wave at me.
So what floor was she on?
佢有 the top floor.
She was on the top floor.
Top floor.
My mother had never seen the barracks. We found on the wall many poems.
仰望屋輪，雙指尺，願回祖國自耕鋤。滿腹牢騷難寤寐，聊書數據表情深。This means I look at Auckland, it's so close from here, but I rather go home to the old country to farm. My heart is full of sadness and sorrow. I cannot sleep. I'm writing this poem to express my sad feelings.
In 1979, Mary Lee Young attended the dedication of the monument to those detained on Angel Island. She was joined by several generations of her family, celebrating the memory of Mrs. Yoke Suey, who struggled against Chinese exclusion and won.